Please welcome Dr. Hari Deva.
Yes. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. So I will start with a quote from Douglas Hofstadter, author of the famous book Gödel-Escher-Bach, who had a controversy with the composer David Cope in 2001. Cope had developed the AI program Emmy, which could generate compositions in the style of classical composers. And in reference to these Emmy compositions, Hofstadter writes the following in his essay: "Staring Emmy straight in the eye and doing my best not to flinch." What troubled me most is the notion that things that touch me at my deepest core, pieces of music most of all, which I have always taken as a direct soul-to-soul message, might be effectively produced by mechanisms thousands, if not millions of times simpler than the intricate biological machinery that gives rise to a human soul. This prospect rendered more vivid and perhaps even near-seeming by the development of Emmy worries me enormously, and in my more gloomy moods I have articulated 3 causes for pessimism listed below. Chopin is a lot shallower than I had ever thought. Music is a lot shallower than I have ever thought. The human mind or the human soul is a lot shallower than I have ever thought. The three reasons for pessimism Hofstadter gives in the face of these Emmy compositions symbolize what might be called the horror of posthumanism. Posthumanism, or more precisely technological posthumanism, is a futurist movement that assumes that humans are imperfect beings who can and should be improved physically and intellectually through technological evolution. In the radical version of posthumanism, technologies such as artificial intelligence and mind uploading are expected to create new forms of intelligence for which humans will become superfluous. If composing music is considered the epitome of human creativity, and creativity in turn defines the essence of human beings, then AI composers like Emmy may anticipate such a posthumanist age. The question I want to discuss here is whether this horror of posthumanism is justified in light of recent advances in AI compositions. But first, let's listen to this aesthetically beautiful and intellectually disturbing music, the concerto in the style of Bach, Part 2. It is such musical passages that already questioned fundamental humanistic convictions 2 decades ago. This disturbance has intensified with the invention of deep learning systems, since these composition programs are much more potent than David Cope's Emmy. in this respect, one can make the working hypothesis that in the near future, any musical style can be perfectly reproduced with the help of an AI. But does it make AI music an agent of posthumanism? I begin with some remarks about music history. In relation to this history model, I will then discuss the impact of AI on composing art music. And finally, I would like to convince you that posthumanism gets caught up in a posthumanist fallacy about art music. Art music became modern in the mid-19th century when it negated the traditional guiding idea of beauty and instead began to explore other aesthetic values such as the aesthetic event, aesthetic ambivalence, and the purified aesthetic sublime. For the arts, this marks the beginning of the phase of material aesthetics or material progress that gives rise to the art of classical modernism with its many isms like expressionism, impressionism, cubism, surrealism, and so on. In the visual arts, the paradigm of material aesthetics came to an end as early as in the 1960s in conceptual art, where the artwork is reduced to a representation of an idea. Ultimately, contemporary art cannot simply abandon its claim to newness and novelty. In this respect, postmodern art was only an interim solution. But there is an alternative. It is possible to redefine the meaning of newness. If newness of an artwork can no longer be established by the discovery of new aesthetic material, which then evokes new aesthetic perception and aesthetic experience in the recipient, novelty can always be generated by a new aesthetic content. Although here I prefer to speak of Gehalt. Gehalt is an untranslatable German philosophical term in the tradition of Hegel and Adorno that has a similar but slightly different meaning than content. For a brief definition, I would say Gehalt is content generated by an interpretation of an artwork. Conceptual art thus appears as a turning point in modern arts. It marks a zero point in art history where a paradigm shift from material aesthetics to gehalt-aesthetics took place. This gehalt-aesthetic turn happened long ago in the visual arts and in poetry, but only recently in new music. That is, in the art music of the 20th century, which emerged from classical music and its institutions. The evolution of the new music system has been delayed for almost half a century because it was composed and performed mainly as purely instrumental or absolute music. In the course of the digital revolution, that is in the last 15 years, a new form of art music has emerged, which I would like to call relational music, in contrast to the term absolute music. In relational music, composers use the computer as a universal interface on which they can compose not only with sounds, but also with images, texts, spoken language, and video. Whereas absolute music can only convey very abstract content via a title, relational music can express a very complex aesthetic content or Gehalt. I refer here very briefly to a theory model of aesthetic modernity. For a detailed account of this model, please see the lecture Conceptual Music and the Gehalt-Aesthetic Turn on my YouTube channel. Using this history model, we can now venture a prognosis of how artificial intelligence will affect art music in the future. First, let's specify hypothesis 1, which I made in regard to David Cope's Emmy compositions. On the one hand, we are always talking here about a weak AI and not about a strong or an artificial or general intelligence. The hypothesis is that a weak AI can generate perfect stylistic variations of any given musical style or ism. On the other hand, this hypothesis must be limited to the paradigm of material aesthetics, and thus concerns only the compositions of pure instrumental music. In addition, the history model contains a second hypothesis, namely that the paradigm of material aesthetics has been exhausted. This is especially supported by the fact that the arts changed into the mode of postmodernism almost half a century ago, and that in fact no new styles or isms have been developed during this time. An explanation for this end of material progress in the arts would be that the human perceptual apparatus is limited, and accordingly there are only a limited number of aesthetic eigenvalues to be discovered, in relation to which new styles and isms can be formed. If these two propositions are correct, then this will lead to a devaluation of newly composed instrumental music. AI compositions can be easily produced, so instrumental music will no longer be governed by the laws of an economy of scarcity, but by those of an economy of abundance. Thus, the progress of AI composition programs will accelerate the process in which art music will gradually turn to forms of relational music, thereby creating the conditions for gehalt-aesthetic compositions. This supports even more our third hypothesis, that in art music a gehalt-aesthetic turn is taking place. Not only do gehalt-aesthetic compositions have much greater scope of innovation than pure instrumental pieces, but they also have the advantage of being AI resistant. Gehalt-aesthetic art cannot be emulated by weak artificial intelligence. AI systems like AMI are not able to combine sound, text and images in a meaningful way. And this brings me to my third part of my talk, in which I would like to conduct a thought experiment and address the impact of artificial general intelligence on the really difficult cases of gehalt-aesthetic art music. My example of this is the work of the Norwegian composer Trond Reinholdsen, who not only composes the pieces but also produces and performs them alone with a virtual orchestra. The composer also produces all the voices himself by recording his own voice and editing it on the computer. The figures you see here are actors who only imitate the movement of the singers, but they do not sing themselves. The music does not follow any specific musical aesthetic. It celebrates a radical stylistic pluralism where the choice of musical style depends on the content or the gehalt of the actual piece. I would like to play a short clip for you. In this episode you will see three characters here on the right side wearing construction foam hats and embarking on a philosophical search for meaning. In doing so, they also sing a cantata that sets to music the notorious sentence from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, "The true is the whole." The figure with the red pointed cap here on the left side is none other than the Hegelian spirit itself conducting the chant. How likely is it that an artificial general intelligence can create such a work? Let's take a closer look at that piece. It is crucial for its reception that Hegel's philosophy is visually contextualized through this kind of art-brute aesthetics. The audience is thus confronted with an extreme performative contradiction between the anti-intellectualism of art-brute aesthetic and the hyper-intellectualism of Hegelian philosophy. At first glance, Reinholdsen seems to work with the means of deconstruction. In theater and opera, deconstruction becomes a technique of unmasking, in which the what is disenchanted by the how. For example, when a theater director has the king appear as a pop singer in a Shakespeare play, it delegitimizes usually the king's claim to power and authority. However, the implicit prerequisite for deconstruction is that the audience can actually recognize in the king a person who indeed possesses great power and authority. The three figures with these colorful foam heads instead are childlike creatures that do not allow themselves to be exposed. You can't discredit what they say by the way they say it. This is precisely the function of the art-brute aesthetic in this episode. It creates characters that resemble a blank slate and cannot be deconstructed. When the foam heads recite Hegel, they do so with infantile seriousness. So one cannot help but believe that they are actually convinced that the true is the whole, and they try to convince us as the public that that sentence is true. In the Hegel cantata, deconstruction turns against its own principle and deconstructs itself. What one experiences is a kind of deconstruction. In other words, the opera questions a fundamental epistemological principle of our default worldview, which is postmodernism today. Once again, how likely is it that an artificial general intelligence can develop such a mind-blowing aesthetic idea? By artificial general intelligence, one usually understands an AI which not only individually mastered specific tasks such as translating, composing, driving a car, playing chess, but like humans can develop all these abilities at the same time. Radical posthumanism assumes that the moment such an AGI exists, artificial intelligence begins to program itself, surpassing human intelligence once and for all, and taking on a non-human, collectivist form of existence. The human subject, as humanism understands it, ceases to exist. The idea of deconstructing the principle of deconstruction through a combination of Hegelian philosophy, art-brute aesthetic, and a Baroque cantata is completely unique and only gains its significance in this historical moment today. There is no training data for such a piece from which an AI could generate such a synthesis of meaning. The problem is not to technically produce such an unlikely combination of sounds, figures, and words, but that more combinations of this kind exist than elementary particles in the universe. So the problem solved by the artist and composer is to choose exactly this one meaningful combination of his imagination. For this purpose, artists use their own subjectivity as a filter. Childlike patterns, special talents, unhappy laughs, obsessive compulsions, reading experiences, and much more are the trigger for whether or not a color, a shape, a word is considered significant in such an artwork. Ultimately, it is the idiosyncratic experience of the artist subject that is the deciding factor in composing such a gehalt-aesthetic piece. In my opinion, posthumanism becomes implausible with such gehalt-aesthetic works as the Hegel cantata, or rather it entangles itself in a posthumanist fallacy. If one assumes that a general artificial intelligence can indeed be conceived as the sum of weak artificial intelligences, then it cannot create advanced artworks because it lacks the aspect of human subjectivation. In this case, advanced gehalt-aesthetic art remains an eternal challenge to posthumanism. On the other hand, if we suppose that a strong AI is an intelligence that is more than the sum of all possible weak AIs and becomes a super-intelligence, then such an AGI could theoretically create advanced gehalt-aesthetic artwork, but it would have to subjectivize itself, like a human intelligence, for this purpose. Such an AGI would have to interact and communicate with other artificial intelligence or other human beings, and then would have also to live with the consequences that result from this interaction. Such an AGI would have to be equipped precisely with the limitations and vulnerabilities of human existence in order to be able to create this kind of art. The autonomy of human subjects would have to be built into an AI artist, but this would ultimately not overcome the basis conviction of humanism about the autonomy of the human subject, but rather strengthen it. The posthumanist fallacy consists in the assumption that artificial intelligence can overcome and replace the human subject, whereas it must presuppose the human subject, at least in the advanced gehalt-aesthetic arts. The horror of posthumanism is therefore unfounded. Even if there are AI programs like AMI which can generate classical music or music in all kinds of styles and isms, neither Chopin nor music nor the human mind are becoming shallower as Hofstadter feared. Rather, the application of artificial intelligence to the arts allows us to better understand the essence of human creativity and intelligence. Thank you very much.